Alex Pombo, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ben. Pleasure to be here.
You are currently working with Partisia. Partisia is an MPC-focused privacy providing chain provider. This is, as I understand, one of many hats that you have worn on this journey into the industry. How did you end up here?
So I wound up working with Partisia Blockchain because I was actually in Paris at the time and they were organizing an event there. And I've known Brian Gallagher, one of the co-founders, for quite a while. And he rang me up because we were going to meet up anyway for, a coffee or a drink or whatnot, because we hadn't seen each other for a while. But then they were also organizing a hackathon, which was actually a really, really great event. It was a lot of fun. And there was a question as to whether or not I could maybe help in the organization of the hackathon, because I'd worked in event management for about 5 years in high school and the early university years in Switzerland. And yeah, I wound up jumping in to help out with the hackathon and just started working together with a really great team at Partisia. And they wound up starting to ask whether or not I might want to take a delve into Web3 and work with them, and jumped at the opportunity. And that was January. And here I am many months later, very much neck deep in Web3.
Fantastic. And you're a political scientist by trade. How does your experience with political science and your previous experiences in this space, how has that translated over into Web3?
Now, there are a couple of different experiences, but I've had the privilege of working for two governments. I was a general intern at the Colombian embassy in Berlin. So there was the sort of a diplomatic sort of background, as well as I worked in migration during the Ukraine crisis for the Swiss Secretariat for Migration, based in Basel, the northwestern Switzerland office, and started basically working there to help aid in the mass wave of people coming from Ukraine and helping to sort out their applications. So those are the two sort of government jobs that gave me certain insight into also potential uses of innovating technologies, like, for example, blockchain. But then there's another whole other background to me, which is that I've had the opportunity of working with a variety of different startups and co-founded two different startups in healthcare in particular, right? And these sort of experiences gave me a sort of a breadth that allowed me to sort of see into different industries and sort of see up to a certain extent how they work, and also how new technologies like blockchain technology, like MPC, could actually really impact them, make them more efficient, and essentially save money and time.
Fantastic. And you mentioned healthcare there. Which subsector of healthcare was that?
So the two companies that I co-founded were involved in the nascent medical cannabis industry. The first one was Neram Pharmaceuticals, that co-founded in Switzerland, in Olsztyn in particular, and was very much focused on supplying different raw ingredients that we were getting through strategic alliances in Latin America to then distribute the healthcare industry in Europe and across the globe. And so that was 2018 that we started that first company. The second company was then one in Slovenia with a slightly different approach. And yeah, we basically launched products during COVID. So it was a bumpy ride to begin with, but a wonderful, wonderful learning experience. And we got distribution in all sorts of different countries and had a very hands-on experience with supply chain management and logistics into all these different countries, with a very, let's say, turbulent regulatory environment surrounding it as well. So
It's interesting you mentioned the turbulent regulatory environment. It is a characteristic of the blockchain space, the Web3 ecosystem. At the moment, a lot of uncertainty in regard to what these assets are, what digital assets are, how they're treated from a regulatory and taxation standpoint. How has your experience in the nascent medical cannabis industry, again, some of the sort of regulatory uncertainty in that space, how has that experience translated across into Web3?
I'd have to say there's one thing that is quite nice coming from, let's say, working a lot in medical cannabis to working in Web3, which is that it is a little bit turbulent with regards to regulatory framework and whatnot, but it's a lot less turbulent. We're really talking about some countries changing legislations 3 times within a year. So, business models getting wiped out multiple times every time somebody would come into that market or set up a company there just within a couple of months. So the turbulence isn't quite the same level of storm. Maybe, a category, a cat 4 hurricane in this case, and in this case, maybe it's a cat 1 or cat 2, but it's still obviously a new industry. And what does most certainly translate is the necessity of good, clear legislation that is actually good for business to actually flourish, for the innovation to actually happen, and gives the right incentives so that that actually occurs in a way that the people writing the legislation actually would want, right? And that
Sure,
that isn't always the case, as we know.
sure. So regulation, legislation, it's a misunderstood term in blockchain and Web3. What do you think individuals operating in the blockchain and the Web3 space misunderstand about the purpose of regulation?
Well, I'd say taking about a step back and looking at it really from a macro perspective, right? If you look at, let's say, a market, right? You look at, let's say, a country like Switzerland, right? If you want to do business in Switzerland, there are certain rules that you have to follow, right? And these are given by the regulation and the incentives that they give, both positive and negative, right? This is the way that you have to do things. If not, you're going to get, taken to court. You're going to get, or if you do this, you get certain benefits, let's say tax benefits and or other benefits, right? To operate a certain way. So it really is about creating the right rules for a market to function and for the actors in a market to act in a way that you want, right? So that's one of the say common misconceptions that people generally sort of have with regards to regulation. Regulation is necessary because otherwise you have anarchy, right? And without getting into a political philosophical debate as to libertarianism, anarchy, and whatnot, and whether that is something that leads to something good or something bad, many people would obviously argue that it could lead to something bad and or complete anarchy with regards to certain services and or goods that are provided, and therefore a lot of lacking security around them, right? In this case, we obviously have seen in Web3 that there's a necessity for certain regulation. I mean, obviously there have been some notorious, to use, for lack of another word, scammers, right? People that have used the lacking regulation, the lacking enforcement, the lacking clarity to make money in ways that most people would not consider quite so moral, right? And good regulation, good legislation put in place and enforced in a way that makes sense is what could allow for, that not to happen, first of all, and second of all, other projects that really want to do something substantial and that want to do something positive to be able to flourish and not have these projects as the let's say the amoral projects as direct competition within this market, right?
Interesting. So I write a lot about governance in the context of policy network, and regulation is an integral aspect of governance, right? Governance being how a given organization is run, the processes that are followed within that organization. Some of the or perspectives that I've come across in regard to regulation is that ultimately it serves as a way for a novel business model or a novel technology or a new way of doing things to interface with an old way of doing things. So it's a way that you
Yes,
can
exactly.
bridge the old world and the new. One of the big topics at the moment within the regulatory bubble, under the regulatory umbrella, as it were, is privacy. Privacy
Mhm.
is one of
Absolutely.
those buzzwords that permeates a lot of the debate in the blockchain space at the moment. What does privacy mean from your perspective?
So I hold a couple of different perspectives as I am Swiss. I'm also American. I'm also Colombian. Privacy can mean a lot of different things. For example, in a Latin American context, it can mean physical security, right? You don't necessarily want people to know certain things because there is a danger, right? From a Swiss perspective, it's generally how things are done. You feel like you don't necessarily want to share too much information for the simple reason that why would you do so? It's your own private information, right? But then there are lots of legal and practical consequences surrounding privacy and especially in the data world, right? Where which is where MPC and Partisia Blockchain sort of come in, and there are new regulations, right? That are sort of groundbreaking, like for example GDPR and other data protection regulations across the globe that are trying to push back on the lack of privacy in the internet, in particular, right? And in the internet, that has been something that obviously has been and continues to be abused by certain actors, especially with an asymmetry of information with regards to how they can actually use new technologies like the internet, like all sorts of digital interfaces to actually get information from people and use that information, right? And so one of the great things that I see happening through Web3 and through different privacy preserving technologies, including multi-party computation, is the ability for people to actually take control of their data, and also the ability, and here we come to what you were touching upon, regulation being put in place, and then also a bridge to, being a bridge to new technologies that are coming into play with regards to the market, is that it allows, when there is a clear legislation with regards to how this new technology can be used, more and more it can be used to solve issues of, for example, let's say GDPR, privacy in the internet and whatnot. And that's one of the things that I see happening a lot in Web3, even before a lot of the regulation actually comes into play here. So I see a lot of potential with regards to that. I'm not completely sure I answered your question with regards to what privacy is to me, but I think that's the direction that we're going down anyway.
100%. Privacy means different things to different people in different contexts. It's one of those nebulous terms that you hear kind of thrown around in Web3 in particular, similar to decentralization. It's like, okay, well, decentralization of what? What is the benefit of decentralization? How is it being applied? Privacy, in the way that I see it personally, is a similar sort of term in that privacy means different things in different contexts. And it's important to understand that there are multiple contexts in which this term can apply, and how the definition of this big picture idea does vary depending on the context in which it's being applied. Now,
and also, yeah. And also the cultural context as well. It changes, right? Between different cultures, there's an emphasis on privacy in certain things and a very different on other things. But that it really very much depends on that, and also business application, right? Some businesses have a lot of importance on privacy in certain things, and some don't really care about privacy of certain things, right?
It's interesting you mentioned the culture aspect. The culture of Web3 has been one of the big draws for many people, it being a more collaborative way of working, looking for ways that can work with other businesses or other organizations or other individuals on more of a partnership basis. What role do you think the culture of Web3 plays in the conversations around privacy at the moment?
So Web3, I see as a little bit, in many ways, a little bit ahead of the curve, right? There are lots of people in Web3. They're already doing something that, many people in, let's say, more traditional business probably wouldn't see applied for another 10 years, right? But then again, most visionaries in anything would probably, have lots of people that would say, well, this is super futuristic. This will only happen in maybe 10 years or whatnot. But in Web3 overall, I'd also say there isn't really one coherent culture because it's a truly global industry, right? One of the things that I found really, really cool about joining Partisia Blockchain was that basically from day one, I was speaking with people from all across the globe, every single corner, and they are all looking to solve different problems that some are very micro, right, and specific to their region, right, that require certain cultural translation as well, and others are solving a very big macro problem that's at a global level, right, or trying to at least. And so that's one of the things that I found quite exciting about Web3 and the Web3 culture, that it's all people, or a lot of people, that are very innovative and trying to be ahead of the curve, but doing so in very different cultural and business contexts and all across the globe, right? And what do I see as the function that this Web3 culture or cultures could provide, is that it very much allows for conversation of these, let's say, ahead of the curve solutions to problems with a new technology that many people still don't quite understand, or many new technologies that also come into that aren't quite the mainstream yet, but becoming more and more so, and will more and more become the mainstream for certain business problems and certain maybe governance problems as well. But it's these people all across the globe with knowledge of their own specific circumstances, their own specific issues, both in their culture and their business and their country, that are coming up with these solutions that could actually then be applied, right, and solve these issues. So it's sort of like a bit of a, a large multicultural incubator for futuristic solutions, right? And I very much do like how open and how vast the scope of the ideas are that are being worked on using these different technologies, and in particular blockchain, that really go out and solve or have business cases in anything possible. So it's extremely diverse.
Absolutely. And I think the point you raise about it being this multicultural, combined cultural marketplace of ideas, effectively, where there are all of these new and these innovative technologies that are growing in different rates, in different ways, and being applied in different contexts for large macro problems to the smaller micro problems. I personally think that this is one of the biggest drivers of innovation in the space, in that there is no longer this Western European, North American dominance of the direction of a specific technology. For example, there's a lot more of a plurality of ideas in terms of application, in terms of development, in terms of how that development is supposed to go, what that process is supposed to look like, which makes things incredibly exciting on the one hand. Sometimes it makes things
Absolutely.
quite challenging, depending on
Awesome.
what's being done and where, how it's being done. You mentioned the lack of regulatory clarity has led to some interesting behaviors from certain actors in the
Absolutely.
space. Sometimes this has been to the detriment of the end user from a financial standpoint. Quite often this has been to the detriment of the end user from a financial standpoint. Circling back
And to the entire industry
and to the entire industry, of
by
course,
extension.
as well. There's
Yeah.
the perception of this technology and the potential applications of this technology in a real world context. Thinking about real world context, crypto is a bit of a dirty word. Some people understand it, some people see it and run a mile. Again, of the connotation, the scams, the history. What are some of the biggest real world applications that you are most excited about of blockchain and then the wider tech stack?
So with regards to crypto, I just wanted to touch upon that. I don't think it's always that dirty of a word. I think it either attracts or makes or puts people off. There are certain people that are very much attracted to it, but for all sorts of different reasons. I know it really has a lot to do with local circumstances. I mean, there are certain markets that have a very, very high blockchain, but in particular crypto adoption, right, for payment systems and whatnot, and other places where just the problems that they're solving with that just don't exist in the same form. And blockchain now, again, we're getting to a very broad industry with so many different potential applications. I mean, everything from supply chain management and logistics. I see lots and lots of potential problems that could be solved using blockchain technology. I see lots in pharma, lots in the medical, in healthcare in particular, governance as well. There's a lot that could be done in a way with blockchain that would be more transparent and with privacy preserving technologies like, for example, multi-party computation. Certain things could be also kept private that need to be kept private, right? And not just in the governance context, but also and let's say in the pharmaceutical context, in the healthcare context, in the logistics context, supply chain context, right? There are so many different applications that could solve real concrete problems or make things more efficient and very, very quite simple ways, really, that I see. And not just me, but I mean, I think a lot of people in the industry would say the same thing. I mean, there's so many things that could be done that aren't being done yet. And that's one of the things where I think is so important that we get the regulation clear and in place, because a lot of the players that have these problems that Web3 solutions could solve can't touch them yet because of the lacking regulation, right? And the longer we have lacking regulation, the more we have the negative stigma around, for example, the word crypto and the blockchain industry, unfortunately, also then gets it as a whole, right?
What are some examples of those simple ways the technology could be used to solve problems?
So as a political scientist, I get very excited about anything to do with governance or, let's say, international organizations and whatnot. I mean, one of them is obviously voting, right? So we have at Partisia Blockchain, we worked on a prototype that I thought was very, very exciting. I think it's very exciting. I shouldn't be speaking in the past tense. It's a voting system prototype that allows for a secret ballot, but with public vote telling, right? So you can keep who is voting and how they're voting private, but you can show how many votes are there for which candidate, right? And when you think about, the recent years and the political turbulence that we've had around distrust, just the distrust in voting system, whether merited or not is a whole other question, but just the distrust by certain people, either from one political party or multiple political parties, in the way an election has occurred, and then the lacking transparency that the current voting systems have, that you think, well, couldn't, for example, let's say a blockchain solution, like, for example, the one with Partisia, that allows for certain privacy, allows for certain security, but also gives the transparency. You can see 150,000 people voted in this geographical area, and you don't see who voted for whom. The people that voted could maybe see who they voted for, right? But you generally can't see, but you can see that there are 150,000 votes, and let's say 50,000 went to this candidate, 25,000 went to that candidate, and the rest went to a third candidate. So you see who the victor is quite clearly, and you could maybe even do that in real time. So there isn't really a question of, wait, somebody stopped counting the votes, what happened, or, where did these votes come from? But that would also require certain trust in and understanding of the technology, which that would be a hurdle that would have to be crossed. But that's one concrete problem in governance that I see today, that blockchain technology, in this case, blockchain and a privacy preserving technology, MPC, could solve potentially.
Absolutely. And I think this ties quite nicely into your recently submitted thesis, the University of Geneva. So congratulations, titled Multi-Party Computation, Blockchain Voting, How Combining Two New Technologies Could Constitute a Major Innovation for Democratic Elections. It's a hell of a title.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. Yeah, I'm quite impressed that you got through it all so quickly. So yeah, I recently had the pleasure of writing about this voting system for my master's thesis. I studied political science in my bachelor's and now my master's as well, and I was quite happy as to the reception as well from my professor, who is very much an expert in democratic innovation, which is sort of his main area of research. Different ways that, for example, maybe new policies or new ways of doing things could make a democratic process better, more secure, etc. And so I was quite happy, first of all, that the proposal was accepted, and then managed to write about it, basically comparing this new prototype voting system that we've developed at the Partisia Blockchain Foundation with all sorts of different types of other e-voting solutions, and basically measuring up the critique that these different e-voting solutions have had. In particular, one paper, Park et al., that is an MIT paper, was published in 2020, that is very much argues against using any kind of digital voting system and whatnot. And I use that more than anything as a sort of a basis for the critique of the voting systems, and then in particular the MPC blockchain voting system, to then show that it actually could, at least in theory, surpass the expectations and actually meet and mediate the different points of critique that they and other authors have raised in the past. So
what were those points of critique?
So there are many different ones. In essence, they said that there was no solution currently that, with regards to any kind of blockchain or e-voting solution, that could meet 5 minimum security requirements. Those being obviously secret ballot, like we spoke about before. Software independence was another one, which essentially means that no change in the software or problem with the software, a bug or whatnot, could not give an undetectable change to the outcome. So what that essentially was mediated by was the blockchain technology itself, as you can actually see and sort of audit these things on an ongoing basis as the transactions occur. You could actually see, hey, wait, something's coming out that doesn't add up mathematically, even if in this case, you don't know necessarily what the underlying transactions are because of the privacy that the MPC provides. Then the third thing was the voter verifiable ballots, that they argued that, if there's no solution in place that you could actually verify yourself that your vote was tallied correctly, basically. And this would also be the case with the solution. The other one being the contestability. So can you publicly contest the outcome? Obviously, in this case, yes, because you have a public blockchain. And the last one being the auditability of the entire system. Can it be not just audited at the end, but continuously? And the answer to that is obviously also yes. There are other critiques. I mean, some of them were very much practical. Those obviously couldn't really be addressed because of the very much theoretical nature of the paper, but basically prototype and pilot projects and whatnot would have to be done to really assess those. But that's it in a nutshell, really.
So could you walk us through, as it's a theoretical paper and you've obviously levied some responses to these critiques, could you walk us through how a voting system that is combining blockchain and multi-party computation would work at a high level?
So there are a couple of things that would have to be done. One of the things that's very important at the beginning is the verification of the voter, right? Because that's obviously one of the things that caused, whether true or not, a whole other question, but one of the things that caused a lot of people to distrust voting system, right? So that would have to be done in a way where, for example, you would log into a system, and to be able to access your voting system, right, you'd have to maybe have facial recognition plus your ID, and obviously every time that you log out, that you have to do that again and again and again. So it's clear that you, and really only you, are voting while you're voting, right? But that would have to be done by, let's say, a third party maybe plug-in, or at least that information should not necessarily be transmitted so directly to obviously the institution that's counting the votes for the secrecy, right? The secret ballot, right? That we obviously spoke about, that's so important in the democratic process here. What would then have to occur would be that a vote would have to be placed in a way that the vote that's on the or that's counted and at the end of the day and visible on the public blockchain cannot be connected to, let's say, the certain public key of the person that's doing the vote. So it can't be viewable that this public key is casting this vote, right? So that would have to be done with MPC. And what essentially I see at a very high level is the opportunity that this presents is that you could have, an election, you see the time that votes are being placed in real time. You could see, oh, somebody just voted and it was for this candidate. You don't know who the person is. You can't follow it back, but you know that there was a vote and there was a vote for a certain candidate, right? And there are ways to obfuscate certain information that would have to be implemented. But at the end of the day, real time tallying of votes with all of the transactions occurring in a way that you can verify that they are mathematically sound, right? Without giving the information on the individual person that's doing the vote, but also then allowing the individual person to be able to then view where that their vote has truly been tallied in the way that they wanted to. And this all happening during a period of time where a ballot can be open, a ballot that can be closed. And at the end of that, you have it closed and that's it. You could maybe even do it in a way that people could change their vote up into a certain date, right? So I see that as the potential. And I would hope that a solution like that could actually combat the distrust in voting that we've been seeing. That it is a major threat to the functioning of democracies across the globe, and has been in the past years for sure.
Absolutely. And multiple elections for multiple significant events, taking Brexit in the UK as an example, and then obviously presidential elections in the US as well. There's a lot of distrust around the process and also the institution as a whole at the moment. And these are fundamental features of the structure of our societies. So finding ways to allay that distrust is an important thing if these system structures, institutions are to continue functioning in the way that they have into the future. A big problem to tackle. How do you think the complexity of this technology is one of the big issues? How would Joe Public understand how this technology can fix that distrust? What needs to be understood about how this lack of trust in these systems can be solved using this technology?
So it would have to be very easily viewable. It would have to be a very, very simple interface made where people could really sort of view this, right? But secondly, there would have to be education, right? So there would have to be a lot of information given out by multiple parties, right? I mean, the government in some places is very trusted, in other places it isn't. It also depends on who's in power, depending on where you are, right? And some places the government is very trusted. Like, for example, in Switzerland, in general, people trust the government, which if you're in the government is obviously also something that is relatively, let's say, nice compared to other places where people really don't trust the government at all, right? Or don't trust a particular government that's in power at that moment, right? So it very much also depends on the circumstances on the ground in the country where the let's say this pilot project or this voting system would then be implemented. But I would say first and foremost education and understanding of the technology and understanding of how the system works and how it can be verified.
So now we have an understanding of how these systems can potentially help and what is required from an educational context in terms of getting the public to understand, no, this is actually beneficial. This is something that is a net positive for democratic institutions. Beyond education and beyond the underlying technology itself, what additional hurdles do you need?
Well, one of the big ones is obviously the regulation, right? So if there's no coherent regulation in place in a country, then such a system would not be able to really be used. And the other one is obviously cybersecurity. So it also really comes down to the first solution that's implemented. I mean, there was one example, which was, for example, votes, right? Votes was a blockchain solution that was implemented in a couple of states in the United States that unfortunately did have some major, let's say vulnerabilities, right? And that led to more distrust in this kind of any voting system, right? And so it's very important that when there is an implementation of, let's say, a blockchain-based voting solution, like maybe an MPC blockchain-based voting solution like we have at Partisia, that it is done and tested and tested and tested before being implemented to avoid a votes type situation, and that it is all very sound, not just necessarily for the company or organization doing the implementation of this voting system, but for the entire industry as a whole, because it reflects back to all sorts of different other kinds of enterprise and especially GovTech implementations as to, from the perspective of somebody in an institution, hey, let's give these Web3 people a shot. And then if they blow it, then there's a lot of distrust in Web3 applications for anything really, because unfortunately it's not always so differentially viewed as maybe somebody who's on the inside of the industry. Because, oh, look, why didn't you do this? And it's like, well, no, we use your blockchain. It's like, well, yes, but you could have done this, and this, and you wouldn't have had that issue. But that's one of the big hurdles that I see, and one of the big risks.
Do you see adoption of voting technologies like what you've got, Partisia, being adopted by governments or used in public elections at any time soon? If it is going to happen soon, what does that adoption like? How would that unfold?
Someday, I think there will be systems like that one implemented for national election. Really, I think the next couple steps will probably not be that long. They will probably be more down along the lines of, let's say, shareholders meetings, private sector implementations that allow for certain secret ballot that are important, but that aren't quite as high stakes as the holy grail of voting, which is a national election in a democracy. It's also the thing to work towards, right? And even if it is a public sector implementation, if it is a government implementation, it would have to start out small. It would have to start out maybe as a municipality level or even sub-municipality level test run of a prototype. And then that would have to be ascertained. It would have to be ascertained as to how well did it go, and lots of testing would have to occur before that were taking place, as it were taking place afterwards. And then things would have to occur step by step, growing and growing as the confidence, not internal from the industry, but external, grows more in this kind of voting system.
Where can people get in touch with you to learn more about what you're doing with Partisia, or get in touch with you on a personal basis? Where's the best place for people to reach out?
So I'm obviously on LinkedIn as Alex Pombo, and I assume we're going to be sharing all sorts of different kinds of social media there. I am also on Telegram. I have an email address that we'll be sharing, and but LinkedIn is a very good place to start.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that all of those social links are in the description. Alex, thank you so much for your time today. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
you. Really appreciate the deep dive that you've given into the mouthful of your thesis, and really excited to see where this technology goes and how it can be applied in this context to solve some pretty big problems. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you everyone for listening.